Roland Voss didn't even look at her when he said it. He just leaned back in his chair at the front of the auction yard, arms crossed over his chest, and said it loud enough for the whole crowd to hear. "Somebody ought to stop that fat woman before she wastes what little money she's got left." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Grown men. Men who knew her father, men who had eaten at her table. Mara Whitlock stood in the dust with 2 crumpled dollar bills in her hand, 38 half-dead goats behind a rotted gate in front of her, and every single person in Red Hollow Ridge watching to see what she would do next. She bought every last one of them, and what those dying goats produced 2 summers later, in the worst heat the valley had ever recorded, didn't just shock the people who laughed at her. It broke them. If this is your first time here, welcome. The stories we tell on this channel are about ordinary people who refuse to stay down. And I promise you, this one will stay with you. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. Drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The morning Mara Whitlock changed her life, she almost didn't get out of bed. That's the part nobody talks about. People hear the story later, the auction, the goats, the cheese, and they imagine some woman who woke up with fire in her chest and a plan already drawn out in her head. They imagine confidence, certainty, some kind of vision handed down from the sky. The truth was messier than that. Mara had been awake since before 4 in the morning, lying on her side in the dark, listening to the sound of Caleb breathing beside her and doing the math in her head for the 100th time. The numbers never changed. They were behind on the mortgage. The east pasture had gone dry. The last of the cattle they'd tried to raise on this sorry patch of rock and scrub had been sold off in March. And what they'd gotten for those animals hadn't even covered what they owed to the feed store. $2. That's what they had left in the household envelope tucked inside the tin box under the kitchen floorboard. 2 actual paper dollars, soft and worn at the folds, that she had been too stubborn to spend on anything because spending them would have meant admitting it was really that bad. She was 31 years old. She had grown up watching her father work this same land until it worked him into the ground. She had married a good man who trusted her judgment even when he probably shouldn't have. And now she was lying in the dark counting her remaining money on her fingers, like a child counting pennies, trying to figure out what in God's name she was going to do next. She got up at 4:15. She didn't wake Caleb. She pulled on her work clothes in the kitchen by feel, laced up her boots, and stood at the window drinking cold coffee left over from the night before, staring out at the hills. The sky was still black. The hills were just shapes against slightly less black, rolling and rough, covered with that low thorny brush that grabbed at your legs when you walked through it and tore up the boots of every hired hand who'd ever made the mistake of crossing it without chaps. Worthless land, people said. Rock and thorn and hard clay that breaks your plow and starves your cattle and sends your horses home limping. She'd heard that her whole life. But she was looking at those hills that morning and thinking about something her grandmother had written in the back of an old journal. Not written to Mara, not written for anyone really, just written down the way old women sometimes write things down because they have nobody left to say them to. Goats don't need what other animals need. Give them brush and rock and something to climb, and they'll give you everything. Her grandmother had kept goats on a different kind of land, 50 miles south, and she had made cheese from their milk for 20 years. She hadn't gotten rich doing it, but she hadn't starved either. And there had been a time, when Mara was about 8 years old, when her grandmother had pressed a small round of pale cheese into her hand and said, very quietly, like it was a secret, "This is what this land gave me. Don't you ever let somebody else tell you what your land is good for." Mara had forgotten that for a long time. Standing at the window that morning, she remembered it. She pulled on her coat, picked up the tin box from under the floorboard, took out the $2, and folded them into her front pocket. Then she walked 3 miles to the auction yard. The Consolidated Valley Livestock Auction happened twice a month in a covered yard on the south end of town, and it drew ranchers from 40 miles in every direction. It smelled like animal fear and sawdust, and the particular kind of cigarette smoke that only old men who've been working since before dawn produce. Mara had been going since she was a girl, trailing behind her father, watching him work the crowd the way men like him worked crowds. Quiet, careful, never letting anyone see what he wanted until after he'd already paid for it. She was not quiet about what she wanted. Not because she had forgotten her father's lesson, but because what she wanted was the thing nobody else would admit to wanting, and there was no point pretending otherwise. Pen number 14 held the goats. 38 of them, the auction sheet said. Mixed brush goats, unregistered, unknown breeding, poor condition. The auctioneer had scheduled them last, which was what you did with livestock. You didn't expect to move. You put them after everything else, so the men with real money had already bought what they came for and gone home, and the people left standing were either desperate or curious or too stubborn to quit. Mara studied those goats through the slat fence for a long time before the bidding started. They were thin. Not just thin, hollow. You could count ribs without trying, their hip bones pressed against their hides like something trying to get out. 2 of them had injuries that hadn't been properly cleaned, and one had a leg that turned slightly wrong when it walked. They had the exhausted, suspicious eyes of animals that had learned not to expect anything good from humans. The rancher behind her, a broad man named Deke Calloway, whom she'd known since childhood, looked over her shoulder at the pen and made a sound in his throat. Waste of pen space, he said. Not to her, really, to the air around her. Whoever let those animals get like that ought to be ashamed of himself. Who brought them in? Mara asked. Pelham Estate. Old man died in February. Left everything to a nephew who came out from back east, took one look at the situation, and decided to liquidate. Deke shook his head. Kid didn't even know what he had. Just wanted everything gone. Mara looked at the goats again. One of the larger ones, a grizzled, bony female with ears that hung almost to her jaw, had pressed her nose through the fence slat and was looking directly at Mara with an expression that was, if you were being honest about it, almost accusatory. Like the animal had already decided something about her and was waiting to see if she'd prove it right. What do you think they'll go for? Mara asked. Deke squinted. If they go at all, $1, maybe less. Probably the rendering company will put in a courtesy bid just to clean up the mess. He paused. You're not thinking about those goats, Mara. She didn't answer him. Mara, tell me you're not thinking about those goats. She moved away from him along the fence. Roland Voss arrived at the auction yard at 9:30, which was his habit, late enough that people noticed him come in, early enough that he didn't miss anything. He was the largest cattle operation in the valley, and he moved through public spaces with the particular ease of a man who has never had to introduce himself anywhere. People made room for him without being asked. Men tipped their hats, women smiled automatically, and then looked slightly surprised at themselves for doing it. He spotted Mara near pen 14, and his face did something that wasn't quite a smile. Voss and her father had never gotten along. The specific reasons had shifted over the years, a fence line here, a water dispute there. But the core of it was simple. Her father had refused to sell land that Voss wanted, and Voss was not a man who forgave being told no. When her father died and the land passed to Mara and Caleb, Voss had offered to buy them out at a price that was technically an offer and practically an insult. Caleb had looked at Mara. Mara had said no. Voss had nodded pleasantly and told them he hoped things worked out. He walked over to stand beside her at the pen. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at the goats. Then he said loudly enough, "Somebody ought to stop that fat woman before she wastes what little money she's got left." He said it the way people say things they want to pretend were accidental. Too casual, too offhand, clearly rehearsed. The men around them laughed the way men laugh when the most powerful person in the room makes a joke. Not because it's funny, because it costs nothing to laugh and sometimes costs something not to. Mara heard every word. She didn't look at Voss. She didn't look at the men laughing. She kept her eyes on the goats, and she put her hand in her front pocket, and she felt those 2 folded dollar bills between her fingers, and she thought about her grandmother saying, "Don't let somebody else tell you what your land is good for." The auctioneer called pen 14. 3 people bid. The rendering company's man put in 50 cents. A rancher named Purvis, who Mara suspected wanted them for dog feed, went to 75. Then a silence. Mara said, $2. All of them. The auctioneer blinked. "Ma'am, they're being sold individually." "Then I'll bid $2 per animal and you can do the arithmetic." She looked up at him. "But I doubt you'll get another offer, so if you want to wrap this up before noon, $2 for the lot." Silence in the yard. The rendering man looked at his clipboard. Purvis scratched his jaw. Voss, from somewhere behind her, made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something uglier. The auctioneer looked around. Nobody moved. "Sold," he said. 38 head to... He checked his sheet. "Mrs. Mercer, $2. She handed over the bills. She was broke. She had spent the last money she had in the world on 38 half-dead goats that 3/4 of the valley believed were worthless. She had done it in front of Roland Voss and Deke Calloway and 30 other men who would be telling this story at dinner tables all week, and none of them would be telling it kindly. She picked up the lead rope the auction hand offered her, looped it around the neck of the closest goat, the bony female with the long ears, who did not resist but gave her a long, measuring look, and started walking toward the gate. Voss called after her, "Mara." His voice had a surface pleasantness to it that she had learned to distrust entirely. "You know what those hills are made of, right?" She didn't stop walking. "Rock," he said. "Just rock. Same as it's always been." Caleb Mercer was a patient man. Mara had always believed this was either his greatest virtue or his most dangerous flaw, depending on the day. He had waited out droughts, bad markets, 2 miscarried pregnancies, and 11 years of watching his wife make decisions. He didn't always understand with a steadiness that she had found both comforting and, occasionally, profoundly aggravating. She didn't always want steadiness. She sometimes wanted someone who would argue with her, push back, tell her she was wrong so she'd have something to sharpen herself against. What she got instead, when she came home that afternoon with 38 goats and no money, was Caleb standing at the fence watching the animals file into the south pasture with an expression she had learned to read over 11 years of marriage. It was not anger. It was something more precise than anger. It was the face of a man doing arithmetic. 38, he said, give or take. Mara, I know what it looks like. It looks like we spent our last $2. We did. He turned to look at her then, and she made herself hold his gaze because she owed him that much. She'd made this decision without him, and she knew it, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Tell me the part I'm missing, he said, because I'm looking at those animals, and I'm seeing every dollar we don't have to feed them. They don't need feeding, not really. She turned back towards the hills. They eat brush. Look at those hillsides, Caleb. Look at how much brush is up there. That's what they eat. That's their feed. We're not buying grain for goats. A long pause. And then what? Milk, cheese. She hesitated. Grandma Ellie kept a journal. I've been reading it since March. She knew how to do it, Caleb. She did it for 20 years on worse land than this. Your grandmother died broke. She died happy. Mara turned back to him. That's not the same thing. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the goats, which had begun to spread out across the south pasture with the uncertain, hopeful energy of animals who hadn't had decent space in some time. The big female with the long ears had already found the fence line and was investigating it with her nose with what appeared to be serious professional interest. They're going to get into everything, Caleb said. Probably. Another pause. We're going to need to fix the east fence. It wasn't agreement exact, but it wasn't refusal either. With Caleb, sometimes that was the best you could hope for at the start of something. I'll start on it tomorrow, Mara said. She was already thinking about the aging room. Her grandmother's journal was a thing that had survived 3 house moves and a barn fire and 30 years of being transferred from box to box without anyone in the family quite understanding what it was. It wasn't a proper book. It was a collection of pages that had started as a ledger, then been written over, margin to margin, in the cramped handwriting of a woman who had things to say and not enough paper to say them. Mara had found it the previous winter, going through boxes in the back of the root cellar, and she had spent 3 months reading it in the evenings after Caleb went to sleep, by the light of the kitchen lamp, learning the language of milk cultures and aging temperatures, and the particular properties of goat milk fat that made it behave differently than the cow's milk that most of the cheese-making books talked about. Her grandmother had not been a tidy writer. Her instructions were embedded in personal observations, complaints about the weather, arguments she'd had with neighbors, recipes for things that weren't cheese at all. You had to work for the information. You had to read the whole page to get the single paragraph that mattered, and even then the paragraph assumed you understood things her grandmother had apparently considered too obvious to explain. But Mara had time. She had a lot of time that winter. And by March, when she was doing the math for the first time and understanding just how bad things had gotten, she had also understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that this journal was not just a record of her grandmother's work. It was a set of instructions, specific ones, for this kind of land, for this kind of animal, for a woman with more stubbornness than resources. The root cellar was already there. It ran cool and dark in summer, warmer in winter than the ground above it, and her grandmother had written, in a margin note next to a recipe for aged hard cheese, temperature consistency is everything. I never had a proper aging room. I used what was underground, and it worked better than I deserved. The cellar flooded in spring. That was the problem. Every March, the snowmelt came down from the hills, and the water table rose, and the cellar filled with 2, sometimes 3 inches of standing water that smelled like iron and took weeks to drain completely. It had always been considered just a limitation, a fact of the property that you worked around. Mara stood in the cellar with a lantern on a cold April evening, looking at the watermarks on the walls, thinking about drainage. Caleb found her there an hour later. "You're going to fix the drainage," he said. It wasn't a question. "It's just a matter of slope," she said. "If we cut a channel along the east wall and run it out to the lower pasture." "Mara, we don't have money for lumber." "We don't need lumber. We need a shovel and 2 people willing to dig." He looked at her for a long time in the lamplight. Then he went upstairs and came back with 2 shovels. They dug for 3 evenings. The work was cold, and the cellar smelled terrible, and on the second night Mara hit a rock with the tip of her shovel, and the vibration ran up her arm so hard she dropped it, and stood there in the dark, pressing her hands against her thighs, waiting for the sting to pass, furious at herself for the half-second she thought about quitting. Caleb picked up her shovel without saying anything and kept digging. The drainage worked. Not perfectly. Nothing about any of this was going to work perfectly, but well enough. By May, the cellar ran dry within a week of the snowmelt, and Mara began building shelves from lumber she found in the remains of the old dairy barn at the north edge of the property. Wood that was weathered and rough and absolutely not what you'd choose if you had any choice at all. She didn't have any choice at all. She built the shelves anyway. The first goats came into milk in early June. The quantity was disappointing. Her grandmother's journal had warned her it would be, with animals coming out of the condition these ones had been in. But the quality was something else. Even Caleb, who had been tasting goat milk his whole life with the benign indifference of someone who neither loved nor hated it, stopped the second time she gave him a glass and said quietly, "That's different." "The brush," Mara said, "what they eat changes the milk. Grandma Ellie wrote about it." "Stronger," he said, "more complex." She tried to find the right word. More itself. He drank the rest of the glass without saying anything else. Mara started the first batch of cheese the following morning. It spoiled in 9 days. She'd done something wrong with the culture. She didn't know exactly what, because her grandmother's instructions for that step were embedded in 3 different paragraphs across 2 pages, and she hadn't read them in the right order. She threw the batch out, sterilized everything, and started again. The second batch was better. Not good. It was grainy in the middle and sharper than she intended at the edges, and the rind cracked in a way that the journal said meant something had gone wrong with the humidity, though it didn't say specifically what, but it was edible. She gave half of it to Caleb and ate the other half herself, and they sat at the kitchen table chewing seriously, the way you chew things you're not sure about but don't want to dismiss. "Could be worse," Caleb said. "That's the nicest thing anyone said to me in a month," Mara told him. He smiled at that. Just slightly, but genuinely. She made a note in the margin of her grandmother's journal and started the 3rd batch. By July, she was on her 6th attempt. The batches were getting better, slowly, inconsistently, with setbacks she couldn't always explain, and she had started bringing small samples to the women she knew in town, not to sell, just to get opinions. The opinions were mixed. 3 women told her it was good. 2 were politely non-committal. One said, with the particular cruelty that sometimes dresses itself as honesty, "Mara, honey, who's going to buy goat cheese out here? People want real cheese." Mara thanked her for her time. She kept making it. Word traveled, the way word always travels in a valley where everyone knows everyone else's business, and most of it isn't interesting enough to repeat but gets repeated anyway. By August, people were saying that the Whitlock woman had bought a bunch of diseased goats at auction for pocket change, and was trying to make cheese out of their milk in some hole in the ground. Roland Voss, at a gathering that Mara heard about secondhand, said it was the most foolish agricultural investment he had ever observed in 30 years of ranching, and he said it with a warmth that made clear he found the whole situation genuinely entertaining. Mara, when she heard this, was in the cellar checking the humidity on her latest batch. She stood very still for a moment after the woman told her. Then she finished checking the temperature, made her notes, covered the aging rack, and went back upstairs. She did not say anything about Roland Voss. But she did go back to the kitchen table that night and open her grandmother's journal and start reading from the beginning again, more slowly this time, looking for things she might have missed. She found 4. The next batch aged for 5 weeks instead of 3. When she cut it open, it was the best thing she had ever made, and she knew it, and Caleb knew it, and for one evening in late September, in the kitchen of a ranch that was still mortgaged past what they could comfortably manage, with 37 goats that had survived the summer and were starting to look like animals that expected to keep surviving. For one evening, that was enough. Tomorrow, she would need to figure out how to sell it. But tonight, she sat across from her husband and watched him eat a slice of pale, firm, perfectly aged cheese on a piece of day-old bread, and she watched his face when he tasted it, and she held on to what she saw there, because she was going to need it later. She was going to need it when things got much harder. The cheese that changed everything almost didn't make it through October. Mara had been aging the new batch for 4 weeks when she noticed the rind on the southwest corner of the rack had started to mottle, a gray-green bloom that her grandmother's journal described in 2 different places with 2 different conclusions, one of which said it was a natural development that could be brushed away, and one of which said it was the beginning of spoilage that would spread to every wheel on the shelf if you didn't pull the affected pieces immediately. The 2 entries were written 18 months apart, and her grandmother had not apparently thought to reconcile them. Mara stood in the cellar with a lantern in one hand and the journal open in the other, and she made a decision the way she'd been making most decisions lately, not from certainty, but from the best guess she could form with the information she had. She brushed the affected rinds. She adjusted the ventilation by propping the cellar door open 2 inches with a wedge of scrap wood. She checked every wheel twice a day for the next week. 3 of them spoiled anyway. She pulled them and buried them out behind the east fence at dusk, alone, without telling Caleb, because she was tired of reporting failures, and she needed one evening where she didn't have to watch him absorb the information with that patient, careful face that she loved and sometimes resented. She came back inside and washed her hands at the kitchen basin and stood there looking at the water running over her knuckles for longer than she meant to. 22 wheels left on the rack, 6 weeks of work. 6 weeks of milk that she couldn't afford to waste. She dried her hands and went back to the journal. The problem with making cheese from scratch, with no teacher and no formal equipment and a cellar that was almost but not quite the right temperature, was that every mistake cost more than just the batch. It cost time she didn't have and milk the goats had produced at the expense of their own body weight, because they were still recovering, still putting on flesh month by month, and every ounce of milk they gave her was an ounce their bodies might otherwise have used on themselves. She felt that debt every morning when she walked the south pasture and looked at them. They were better than they'd been in June, noticeably better. The hip bones didn't press so hard, the coats had started to fill in, and 3 of the older females had developed the particular sleek stubbornness of animals who had decided to stick around. But they weren't right yet. They wouldn't be right until spring, maybe not until the summer after. She was building something on a foundation that was still being built. That was the specific anxiety of it, not the fear that it would fail because she had made her peace with failure as a possibility, but the fear that it would fail for a reason she should have seen coming and didn't. Caleb saw it in her face one evening in late October and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "What did you lose?" She looked up from the journal. "In the cellar," he said. "Last week. I saw you go out to the east fence," she told him. 3 wheels. The modeling problem. The 2 different entries in the journal that said 2 different things. He was quiet for a moment. Which one was right? "I don't know yet." She paused. "The ones I brushed are still okay. The ones I didn't brush, those are the ones I buried." "So you were right." "I made a decision. That's not the same as being right. I could have gotten lucky." He looked at her across the table. "Mara, give yourself something." "I'll give myself something when I have something to give." She closed the journal. "We're behind on the November payment." "I know." "How far behind?" $40. She exhaled slowly. $40 was not a number she could argue herself out of. It was not a problem that had a clever solution. It was just a number, sitting there, solid as a stone. "I'm going to bring a sample to Hetty Boone on Friday," she said. Hetty Boone ran a dry goods counter on the north end of town that also sold specialty items on consignment, pickled things, preserves, a few luxury goods that came in on the freight wagons from the eastern supply routes. She was a practical woman with a good eye for what her customers would spend money on and a total unwillingness to carry anything she didn't believe in. If she'll take it on consignment, even at a small margin, she'll want to taste it first. Obviously. Caleb nodded slowly. Which batch are you going to bring her? The one that's been aging since September, the 5-week wheel. He was quiet again. She watched him thinking, which was a particular thing to watch. He got very still, and his eyes went slightly unfocused, and he tapped his thumb against the table edge without realizing he was doing it. That's your best one, he said. That's why I'm bringing it to Hetty. If she says no, then I go back to the cellar and I figure out what to do next. Mara stood up and took their cups to the basin. I'm not going to sit here and think about what happens if she says no, Caleb. I'm going to go there Friday and try. He was quiet for one more beat. Then, I'll hitch the wagon. Hetty Boone was 62 years old, had outlived 2 husbands, and had been running her counter since before half the valley was settled. She was not a woman who was easily impressed by anything, and she was specifically not impressed by people who came to her with product they were visibly nervous about. She always said you could tell everything about what something was worth by how confident the person selling it was when they put it in front of you. Mara came in on Friday morning with a wheel of cheese wrapped in clean cloth and set it on Hetty's counter without saying anything about it first. She unwrapped it, took out her belt knife, cut a thin wedge, and pushed it across the counter. Hetty looked at it, looked at Mara, picked it up and smelled it first, which was the right instinct, Mara thought, and something she hadn't expected, and then tasted it. A long pause. What's in the rind? Hetty asked. Salt and thyme. I've been rubbing them with brine every 4 days. Where are you aging it? Root cellar. I've got the humidity around 65% most days. Hetty cut another piece for herself without asking. Mara took that as a reasonable sign. I've had cheese from back east that costs 3 times what I could sell this for, Hetty said, not looking up. It's not as good as this. Mara kept her face neutral. I could bring you 4 wheels by end of November, more in the spring when milk production picks up. I'd want exclusive on whatever you make for the next 6 months. 60-40 split, my favor. Hetty looked up then. Most people who came to her counter accepted whatever she offered because they needed the relationship more than they needed the margin. The fact that Mara had named a number first, and named it clearly, made Hetty's mouth do something that wasn't quite a smile but was in that neighborhood. 60-40, Hetty repeated. The cheese is the product. You're the location. Another pause. Hetty rewrapped the wheel and slid it back across the counter to Mara. 55-45. And I want a new wheel every 2 weeks through winter, consistent as you can make it. Mara picked up the wheel. Done. She was back in the wagon before she let herself breathe properly. Caleb was waiting on the bench, reins loose in his hands, watching her face when she came out. Well, he said. 55-45. She climbed up beside him. She took exclusive for 6 months. A silence. Mara, he said, in the tone he used when he was working out whether something was good or bad. I know. Is that going to cover the mortgage? Not by itself, not yet. But it's a start, and it's real, and it's ours. She took the reins from him and clicked to the horse. Let's go home. I've got 4 wheels to finish by the end of the month. November came in cold and mean. The first real freeze hit the valley the second week of the month, and Mara spent 2 mornings she didn't have breaking ice in the water troughs before the goats could drink. The temperature drop changed the cellar dynamics in ways her grandmother's journal hadn't fully addressed, and she spent 3 evenings recalibrating, adjusting the wedge on the door, repositioning wheels on the rack, checking temperatures against the notes she'd been keeping in the back pages of the journal in handwriting that was starting to look like her grandmother's, which she noticed one night and stopped and looked at for a moment before continuing. The 4 wheels for Hetty were ready the last week of November, and she delivered them herself, driving through a thin sleet that stung her face and made the road slippery under the horse's feet. Hetty had them behind the counter by noon. By the following Tuesday, 2 of them were sold. By the end of the week, all 4 were gone, and Hetty had sent a note with the payment asking if Mara could do 6 wheels for December. The payment wasn't enough to make up the $40 shortfall on the mortgage, But combined with the small amount she'd saved from what Caleb earned doing repair work for neighboring ranches, they were close enough that the bank accepted a partial payment and deferred the remainder to January without, so far, making any formal complaints about it. Mara knew that wouldn't last. Partial payments and deferred balances were the kind of kindness that banks extended exactly once before they started talking about terms. She was in the cellar that first week of December, setting up the 6 new wheels, when she heard the wagon come up the drive. She heard Caleb's voice, and then another voice she didn't immediately recognize, and then Caleb called down through the cellar door. "Mara, someone here to see you." She came up with her hand still smelling of brine and her apron dirty from the morning's work, and found a young man standing in her yard who introduced himself as the freight coordinator for the Boone Trading Company. Hetty's nephew, it turned out, though the trading company and the dry goods counter were separate operations. His name was Garrett Boone. He was younger than she'd expected and more direct than most men his age in the valley tended to be, and he got to the point immediately. Hetty had been talking about the cheese, and 3 freight captains who came through her counter regularly had been asking about it, and was Mara interested in discussing volume supply? She looked at him for a moment. Volume meaning what? Meaning regular orders, consistent. For the mining camps north of the ridge and the supply stores along the eastern freight route. He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "I've done rough numbers. If you could supply 20 wheels a month, I could guarantee purchase at a price better than what Hetty's offering you." 20 wheels a month. Mara's current capacity, at full production with the animals she had, was 8 wheels if everything went right, 6 if anything went wrong, which something always did. She took the paper and read it. Then she read it again. "I can't do 20 a month," she said. "Not right now." He nodded, unsurprised. "How many can you do?" 6, maybe 8 by March. "Then we start with 6. He said it like it was obvious. "I've seen operations like this, Mrs. Mercer. You don't start at the end. You start where you are." She looked at him for another moment. He was younger than her by several years, and he'd clearly had more formal education, and she was waiting for the things she'd learned to wait for from men who came to her with offers. The catch. The qualifier. The moment where the terms shifted and you understood what they actually wanted from you. "What's your margin?" she said. 20% on what I sell above Hetty's current rate." 15. He looked at her. "You negotiated with Hetty too, didn't you?" "Yes." 17, he said, "and I want first right of refusal when your volume goes up." 17 and you cover freight costs. A pause. Then he put his hand out. She shook it. After he left, she stood in the yard for a moment in the December cold and thought about 20 wheels a month. She thought about what her herd would need to be to produce that volume, and what she would need in the cellar to age that many at once, and what all of that would cost, and how far she currently was from any of it. Then she went back to the cellar and finished setting up the 6 wheels she had. Winter was the hardest work she'd ever done, and also, in some way she couldn't have easily explained to anyone, the most alive she'd felt in years. She was up before light every morning and working until after dark every night, and the work was physical in a way that had started to reshape her in ways she noticed mainly because her clothes fit differently, and her hands had stopped hurting from the cold the way they had in November. She had always been a large woman in a world that had opinions about that, and those opinions had ranged over her life from the merely thoughtless to the genuinely cruel. And she had developed the particular habit of large women who work with their bodies, the habit of proving the opinions irrelevant by outworking everyone around her until the question of what she looked like became a secondary concern to what she could do. She didn't have hired help. She and Caleb did everything: the morning chores, the milking, the cheese making, the cellar work, the fencing that needed constant attention, because goats treated boundaries as suggestions rather than facts. Caleb had given up the repair work for the neighboring ranches by January because there weren't enough hours in the day for both, which meant they'd lost that income stream, which meant the pressure on the cheese sales was now the only pressure there was. She felt that weight every day. She woke up with it and went to sleep with it, and sometimes in the middle of the night she lay in the dark doing arithmetic the way she had on the morning of the auction. Except now the numbers were more complex and the stakes were higher because there was more to lose. She hadn't just bought 38 goats on $2 anymore. She had made agreements with real people who had put real expectations behind them, and she had persuaded Caleb to give up his backup income, and she had a cellar full of cheese that had to be good enough to justify all of it. There were nights when she was absolutely certain it wouldn't work. Not often. But enough that she knew exactly what that certainty felt like. The cold, specific weight of it at 3 in the morning. The way it made everything she'd done seem not brave, but foolish. The way Voss's voice came back to her in those moments saying, "Just rock, same as it's always been." She had learned to let those thoughts arrive and not fight them, and not agree with them either. She just let them sit there in the dark until the sky started to go gray, and then she got up and went back to work. The second major crisis came in January, and it came from a direction she hadn't expected. Not the cheese, not the goats, not the weather, but Caleb. He came in from the east pasture on a Thursday afternoon walking wrong. She knew it immediately from the window, the particular way he was favoring his right side, the way he held his shoulder. She was at the door before he reached the porch. What happened? Nothing serious. He said it with the specific tone men use when something has happened that they've already decided not to make into a problem. Caleb. The fence post let go while I was setting it. I went down hard. He was moving carefully, she could see. Each step a small negotiation. I think I cracked something, maybe a rib. She got him inside and looked at it, and it was bad enough that she drove him to the doctor in town the next morning, which cost money they didn't have for the visit and the wrapping and the instruction to rest for 4 weeks, which was the kind of instruction that ranchers received and acknowledged and largely ignored. Caleb ignored it for exactly 1 week before he was back outside doing things at half speed, while Mara tried to determine how to do his share of the work, plus her own, without the whole enterprise collapsing. The goats were milking at higher volume now, a genuine improvement that was the result of months of better feed and consistent care, which meant the cellar was busier, which meant she needed more time there, which meant the fencing and the morning troughs and the daily checks on the herd's condition were falling to her in the early hours before the cheese-making work started. She averaged 5 hours of sleep through January, sometimes less. She stopped keeping exact track because knowing the number made it worse. The thing that kept her going, more than the agreement with Garrett Boone, and more than Hetty's steady sales and more than any abstract idea of success, was the herd itself. She had not expected to care about them this much. They were not pets. She did not give them names, mostly, except for the big female with the long ears who had looked at her through the fence on the day of the auction, whom Caleb had started calling Eleanor without discussing it with her, and whom Mara had not corrected because Eleanor seemed to fit. Eleanor had emerged over the months as the animal in the herd that the others organized themselves around. Not the biggest, not the most aggressive, just the one they checked with before doing anything that required group agreement. She had an opinion about everything and communicated it in a series of low, deliberate sounds that were not quite the bleating of a distressed animal, and not quite silence either. Mara had learned to read them the way she'd learned to read the journal, slowly, carefully, with attention to context. One evening in January, exhausted past the point where her thoughts were connecting properly, Mara sat down in the south pasture with her back against the fence post and closed her eyes for what she intended to be 2 minutes. She felt a weight against her shoulder. Eleanor had walked over and was leaning against her with the solid, unhurried pressure of an animal that had decided this was a reasonable arrangement. She didn't move when Mara opened her eyes, just stood there. Mara sat there for 15 minutes. It was the longest she'd stopped moving in weeks. She never mentioned it to Caleb. Some things you keep. February brought the first real sign that something was working. Hetty sent a note with her bi-weekly payment that said, in Hetty's compact handwriting, 3 women asked specifically for your cheese this week, by name. They said they'd heard about it from someone who'd gotten it from a freight supplier. You need to make more. Mara read this note in the kitchen and read it again, and then set it on the table and poured herself a cup of coffee and stood at the window. People were asking for it by name. Her cheese. Made in a root cellar on rock and brush land that everyone in the valley had written off as worthless, with milk from 38 animals that everyone at the auction had written off as dead weight, following instructions that her grandmother had written down for no one in particular in the margins of a ledger that had nearly been thrown away 3 times. People were asking for it by name. She didn't cry. She was too tired to cry. But she stood at that window for a few minutes longer than she needed to, just holding the note and the cup, before she put both of them down and went back to work. Garrett came by in the 3rd week of February with a figure that made her sit down. The mining camps north of the ridge had received their first shipment, and the response had been immediate. The foreman wanted a standing order, monthly, renewable on 90-day terms, at a volume that Mara's current operation could not supply, but that her operation, if she could expand the herd and build out the cellar properly, could reach by late spring. "How much expansion are we talking about?" she said. "Double what you have. Maybe more." He laid the numbers out on her kitchen table, not casually, she noticed, but carefully, in the way of someone who'd prepared this and wanted to make sure she understood all of it. The capital to do it would probably need to come from the bank. But with these contracts as collateral, Voss has connections at the bank, she said. Garrett paused. "I know. He won't want this to go well for me." "I know that too." Garrett folded his papers. "Mrs. Mercer, I work in freight. I see a lot of people try to build things in this valley. Most of them fail because they run out of money before they run out of ideas." He looked at her directly. "You have the ideas. The question is whether you can get to the money before Voss notices what you're actually building." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, she could hear Eleanor making her particular sound, the one that meant something in the herd needed attention, not urgently, but soon. "I'll go to the bank next week," she said. "I'll write a letter of support. The contracts should speak for themselves, but a letter doesn't hurt." After he left, Mara sat at the kitchen table with his numbers in front of her and her grandmother's journal beside them, and spent the next 2 hours doing the kind of arithmetic that feels less like math and more like deciding who you are. How much risk? How much exposure? How much of the fragile things she'd built could she afford to put on the line in order to build something bigger? She had started this with $2 and 38 dying animals and the word of a woman who'd been dead for 12 years. She had made it to February. The bank visit, when it came, was going to be its own kind of fight. She knew that. The Valley's first agricultural bank of Red Hollow Ridge was run by a board that included 3 men who socially overlapped with Roland Voss in ways that weren't quite a conflict of interest but weren't exactly neutral either. She would be walking in there as the woman who'd bought the worthless goats, asking for money to buy more of them, with contracts that were real and production numbers that were real and a reputation that was growing in ways even she couldn't fully measure yet. She would need everything she had, every number, every contract, every piece of paper with Garrett Boone's signature on it and Hetty Boone's name attached. She would need to walk in there looking like someone who knew exactly what she was doing, even on the days when the rib she was pretty sure she'd cracked herself in November. She'd never mentioned it to anyone. Made it hard to sit straight. She went to the kitchen window again. The afternoon light was flattening across the south pasture, and the herd was spread out across the hillside, moving through the brush with the particular focused contentment of animals that had figured out they were going to be okay. Eleanor was at the top of the slope, standing still, looking down at something that might have been nothing. Mara watched her for a minute. Then she went back to the table and started preparing for the bank. The first agricultural bank of Red Hollow Ridge sat on the corner of Main and Caldwell in a building made of sandstone blocks that had been hauled in from a quarry 40 miles east when the valley was still being settled. It was the kind of building designed to communicate permanence, thick walls, heavy doors, small windows that let in just enough light to see by, but not enough to feel comfortable. Mara had been inside it exactly 4 times in her life. Twice with her father, once with Caleb when they'd signed the original mortgage, and once alone 2 years ago when she'd asked for a 30-day extension on a payment and been granted it by a clerk who had the particular expression of a man doing her a favor he expected to be remembered. She went in on a Tuesday morning in the first week of March, wearing the same dress she'd worn to her father's funeral because it was the best thing she owned that still fit properly, with a leather satchel under her arm that held every piece of paper she had. Garrett's contracts, Hetty's sales records, her production logs, the goat health records she'd been keeping since summer, and a 1-page summary she'd written by lamplight the night before that laid out her operation, her current revenue, and her expansion plan in plain language without apology or qualification. Caleb had offered to come with her. She'd told him no. Not because she didn't want him there, but because she'd thought carefully about how she needed to walk into that room, and she needed to walk in as herself, not as somebody's wife, not as a woman who'd brought her husband along because the bankmen would respond better to him. She'd seen that work for other women, and she understood why they did it, and she was not going to do it. If they were going to say no, she wanted them to say it to her face, looking at her directly, with her papers on the table between them. The branch manager's name was Howard Pell. I was in his mid-50s, had been running this branch for 11 years, and had the specific quality of a man who was neither cruel nor warm, but simply transactional. He assessed things, formed conclusions, and acted on them without much interference from feeling. Mara had met him twice before and found him difficult to read, which she respected more than she would have respected easy pleasantness. His assistant brought her into the office at 9:15, and she sat down across from Pell's desk and put her satchel on the floor beside the chair and did not take anything out of it yet. "Mrs. Mercer," Pell said. He had her existing account file open in front of him, which meant he'd already looked at the mortgage history before she arrived, which meant he already knew about the partial payment in December and the deferred balance in January. "I understand you're here about an expansion loan." "I am." She reached into the satchel and took out the one-page summary first, slid it across the desk. "I'd like you to read that before we talk numbers." He picked it up. She watched him read it, actually read it, not scan it the way some people do, but read it word by word, which meant he was either genuinely interested or professionally thorough, and either way was fine with her. When he finished, he set it down and looked at her over his glasses. "You've been operating for 9 months. 8 months at commercial scale. The first month was establishing the herd. And these contracts with the Boone freight operation are signed and in the satchel." She took them out and put them on the desk, along with Hetty Boone's sales records from November through February. "The volume trend is there. It's not a projection. It's what actually happened." He looked at the contracts. He looked at the sales records. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man doing arithmetic, and she let him do it without filling the silence, because she'd learned from her father that filling silences in negotiations usually cost you something. "The collateral you're proposing is the existing herd and the current operation," he said, "and the contracts. They're assignable. The land itself is already mortgaged." "I know what the land is mortgaged for. I'm asking for a separate facility against the business assets and the forward contracts." She kept her voice level. "The numbers support it. I'm not asking you to take a chance on a hope. I'm asking you to look at 8 months of actual production and actual revenue and decide if that's a foundation worth lending against." Pell set the papers down and folded his hands on top of them. "I'll need to take this to the board. We don't approve expansion loans at this level without board review." "When does the board meet?" 2 weeks from Thursday." She nodded. 2 weeks was 2 weeks. She could work with 2 weeks. "I'll need original copies of the contracts," he said, "and a more detailed production projection for the next 12 months. I can have them here by Friday." He looked at her for a moment, not the look she'd expected, not the assessment she'd been bracing for, the one that took in her size and her clothes and her age and the particular category the Valley had put her in. It was more neutral than that, more like a man who was genuinely trying to determine whether the numbers he was looking at were as solid as they appeared. "Mrs. Mercer," he said carefully, "I want to ask you something directly, and I'd like a direct answer." "All right. Is there anything about your operation that isn't represented in these papers? Any liability I'm going to find out about after the board approves this?" She thought about the cracked rib she'd never had looked at. She thought about the 3 wheels she'd buried behind the east fence. She thought about the nights when she'd lain awake doing math and come up short and not written it down anywhere. "The operation has imperfections," she said. "Every batch isn't perfect. I lose wheels. The cellar temperature is harder to maintain in deep winter than I'd like. Those things are normal for the scale I'm working at." She looked at him steadily. "What's in those papers is real. I didn't round up." He nodded once. "Friday, then." She stood, shook his hand, picked up her satchel, and walked out of the bank into the March sunlight, and she made it to the wagon and sat down on the bench and let her hands shake for about 30 seconds, because she had been holding herself completely still in that office for 40 minutes, and something had to give somewhere. Then she picked up the reins and drove home. She had the production projections on Pell's desk by Thursday afternoon, a day early, because the work of putting them together had turned out to be clarifying in a way she hadn't expected. It forced her to be specific about things she'd been carrying in her head in rough form. And when she wrote them down, she found the picture was better than she'd thought in some areas, and worse than she'd thought in others, and knowing the difference precisely was better than not knowing. What she didn't know, and didn't find out until the following Monday, was that Roland Voss had been to see Howard Pell on the Friday she'd submitted her documents. She found out from Deke Calloway, who had stopped by her gate that Monday morning with the slightly guilty expression of a man who knows something uncomfortable and has decided, after apparent internal debate, to say it. "I saw Voss going into the bank Friday afternoon," Deke said. He was leaning on her fence post with his hat in his hands. "Didn't think much of it at the time. But then I ran into his foreman at the feed store this morning, and the man said something that didn't sit right." Mara waited. "He said Voss had told him the Whitlock operation was going to hit a wall soon." Deke looked at her directly. "He said it like he knew something." She was quiet for a moment. The morning was cold and clear, and the herd was moving up the south hillside in the particular loose formation they used when they decided collectively where they wanted to go next. "Thank you, Deke," she said. "Mara, if he's working the bank?" "I know." She kept her eyes on the hillside. "I'm not surprised." "You don't seem surprised." "I've been waiting for it since February." She turned back to him. "I appreciate you telling me. I mean that." He put his hat back on and nodded and drove away, looking like a man who wasn't sure he'd helped, which was a fair assessment. Knowing about a problem and being able to do something about it were different categories of information, and right now all she had was the first kind. She spent that afternoon thinking about what Voss could actually say to the bank board that would carry weight. He had no knowledge of her operation's finances beyond what was publicly available. He had no standing to raise a formal objection to her loan application. What he had was the oldest tool in the valley. His relationships with the men on that board, built over decades, maintained through the particular social currency of shared meals and mutual favors, and the unspoken assumption that what was good for the biggest operation in Red Hollow Ridge was good for the valley as a whole. He couldn't block her loan on the merits. The merits were solid. What he could do was introduce doubt into the conversation, raise questions about the sustainability of the operation, about whether goat cheese was really a long-term proposition or a novelty that would fade when the next supply wagon came through. He could mention the partial payment in December, the deferred balance in January, frame them as signs of instability rather than what they actually were. A business in its first year managing cash flow in the normal, unglamorous way that first-year businesses manage cash flow. He could make the board nervous, and nervous boards didn't approve loans. She sat at the kitchen table that evening with a fresh piece of paper and wrote down every counterargument she could think of to every concern she imagined Voss might raise. Some of them she had answers to, some of them she didn't. For the ones she didn't have answers to, she wrote down the honest version of why she didn't have an answer and whether that actually mattered or not. Caleb watched her from across the table. He'd been quieter than usual the last few weeks, which was saying something, and she'd been too occupied to ask him about it directly. But tonight he put down the harness he'd been mending and said, "Talk to me." She told him about Voss and the bank, all of it, Deke's visit, what she thought Voss was doing, what she thought the board might do about it. Caleb listened without interrupting, which was his way. When she finished, he sat for a moment. "What do you need?" he said. Not what are we going to do or how bad is this or any of the other things he could have said. Just, what do you need? She looked at him. "I need someone to go talk to Garrett Boone. Not about the loan, about the water rights thing." She'd heard a rumor 2 days ago that she hadn't yet confirmed, that Voss had filed something with the county assessor's office relating to the creek that ran through the north edge of her property, the creek that the goats used as a secondary water source in summer. "I need to know if it's a real filing or just a threat." Caleb nodded. "I'll go tomorrow." It was a real filing. Garrett confirmed it 2 days later, having gone to the assessor's office himself with a directness that Mara found herself grateful for in the way you're grateful for rain after a long dry spell. Voss had submitted a preliminary claim on the water rights for the North Tributary, citing an old territorial ordinance about upstream usage that was, and Garrett said this carefully, technically valid, but had never been enforced in the valley because the creek had always been considered shared water under common use. "Can he actually take it?" Mara said. "He can try to make it expensive enough that you can't fight it." Garrett was sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him. "That's probably the point. A legal dispute over water rights costs money you don't have, and if it creates uncertainty about the property during the bank's review period, it makes the loan harder." She finished the sentence for him. "He's not trying to win the water case. He's trying to muddy the water." She paused at the accidental phrase. "You know what I mean?" "I do." Garrett looked at her. "Mrs. Mercer, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." I've been honest with you this whole time. I know, that's why I'm asking. He set down the coffee cup. Is there anything about your operation that Voss could expose that would actually damage the loan application on its own merits? Not rumors, not relationships, actual facts that would give the board a real reason to say no? She considered the question seriously, the way it deserved to be considered. The partial payments in December and January looked bad taken in isolation. Okay. The water rights dispute, if it becomes active, creates a liability question about the property that we can address with a statement of alternative water sourcing. You have the well. The well's marginal in summer. She said it even though she didn't want to. It handled last summer. I don't know about the one before. He wrote that down. We'll commission a water yield assessment. I can cover the cost. We get a professional assessment on record that the well is adequate. The water rights dispute becomes academic. She looked at him. Why are you doing this? Because your cheese is selling better than anything else on my freight route, and I'd like it to keep doing that. He said it plainly, without performance. Also because Voss tried to cut me out of a contract 2 years ago, and I have a long memory. She almost smiled at that. So this is about your interests. Everybody's interests. That's how things work when they work well. He picked up his coffee cup, remembered it was cold, and set it back down. The board meeting is in 9 days. We need to be ready. The next 9 days were some of the most grinding she could remember, and she was setting that bar against a winter that had included a cracked rib and 5-hour nights, and 38 starving goats coming back from the edge of something irreversible. The difference was that the grinding was not physical this time, but strategic, which was a different kind of exhaustion, the kind that lived behind your eyes and made it hard to stop thinking even when you needed to sleep. She submitted a supplemental document to the bank laying out the water situation and attaching the preliminary results of the yield assessment that Garrett had arranged, which showed the well at adequate capacity for current and projected herd size through all seasons. She wrote it in the same plain language she'd used in the original summary. No defensiveness, no over-explanation, just, here's the situation, here's the relevant information, here's what it means for the operation's viability. She also called in a favor she'd been holding for 2 years. A woman named Cora Settle, who had grown up 4 miles north of her and married into a family with ranching connections that ran deeper than Voss's in some parts of the valley, had been one of the 3 women who told her the cheese was good back in November when she'd been going around with samples. Cora was not a woman who traded in favors openly. She was too smart for that. But she had a particular relationship with 2 of the board members' wives, and she had mentioned once, in passing, that she thought what Mara was building was the most interesting agricultural development she'd seen in the valley in 15 years. Mara drove out to Cora's place on a Wednesday evening and spent an hour at her kitchen table drinking real tea out of proper cups and talking about the cheese and the operation and the loan and what was at stake, and she was honest about all of it, including Voss, including the water dispute, including the partial payments. She didn't ask Cora to do anything specific. She just told her the truth. Cora walked her to the wagon when she left and said, I won't promise anything. I'm not asking you to. But I'll have some people to dinner Thursday night. She said it like it was a completely separate thought. It's been too long since I've entertained properly. Mara drove home through the evening dark and didn't think too hard about what that meant or didn't mean, because thinking too hard about things she couldn't control directly had never once helped her, and she'd mostly learned to stop doing it. What she could control was the cheese. She had 4 wheels coming off the aging rack that week. The best batch she'd made yet, she thought, though she was aware that she always thought that about the most recent batch, and was not always right. She cut a wedge from one of them and tasted it in the cellar alone, standing in the lamplight, and tried to be honest with herself about whether it was actually good or whether she'd been staring at it for so long she'd lost the ability to judge. It was good. It was better than good. The rind had developed exactly the way her grandmother's journal described in the entry she'd found on the second full reading, the one she'd missed the first time because it was buried in a page about something else entirely. The texture had the particular firm yet yielding quality that she'd been chasing since November and hadn't fully achieved until now. The flavor was complex in a way she couldn't fully describe and didn't try to. It tasted like the hillside, like the brush, like something that had earned its character by having to work for it. She cut a second wedge and went upstairs and put it in front of Caleb without saying anything. He ate it slowly, set down his fork. That's different from the others. Better or different? He thought about it. Both. He looked up at her. Is this what you're going to bring to the board? I wasn't planning to bring cheese to a bank meeting. Why not? She opened her mouth and then closed it, because the automatic answer, because that's not how bank meetings work, hit a wall somewhere in her chest when she tried to say it out loud. She'd been preparing documents and arguments and data, all of which were real and solid and necessary. But the thing that had gotten Hetty Boone on her side in the first place was not a spreadsheet. It was the thing she'd set on that counter and let speak for itself. The board approves loans, Caleb said carefully, but they're still people. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she went to the cellar and came back with a half-wheel wrapped in clean cloth and set it on the kitchen table. I need a proper carrying case, she said. Something that looks like I meant to bring it. There's a wooden box in the back of the barn that might work. Clean it up for me? He was already standing. Done. The board of the First Agricultural Bank of Red Hollow Ridge met on the second and fourth Thursday of every month in the conference room at the back of the building, a room that Mara had never been in before and that turned out to be smaller than she'd imagined. 6 men around an oval table, a window that faced the alley behind the building, and a smell of pipe tobacco and old paper that reminded her, unexpectedly, of her father's study. Howard Pell had arranged for her to present before the board's private deliberations, which was not standard procedure and which she suspected had cost him something with at least a few of the men in that room. She was grateful for it without showing it, because showing it would have made it look like she thought she needed the charity. 3 of the 6 men she recognized. 2 were ranchers she knew by sight. One was a lawyer named Croft, who had done work for both her father's estate and, she was fairly certain, for Voss. She looked at Croft when she sat down, and he looked back at her with the smooth, professionally neutral expression of a man who was making sure you couldn't read him. She put the wooden box on the table. She took out her documents and arranged them in the order she planned to address them. And then, before she said a single word about numbers or contracts or projections, she opened the box, took out the half-wheel of cheese, set it on the cloth, and said, "Before I talk to you about the business case, I'd like you to taste what the business makes." A pause in the room, the kind of pause that could go several ways. The rancher to her left, a man named Burchard, whom she'd known at a distance for years, leaned forward slightly. "You brought cheese to a bank meeting." "I brought the reason the bank meeting exists." She took out her knife and cut 6 equal wedges. "Everything I'm going to tell you in the next 20 minutes is in those documents. You can read all of it after I leave, but I found that numbers about food are harder to understand than food itself." She pushed the plate to the center of the table. Burchard took a piece first, then the man beside him. Pell, she noticed, waited until 2 others had taken theirs before he picked one up, which she read as deliberate neutrality. Croft waited longest. When he finally tasted it, his expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A small recalibration that she caught only because she'd been watching for it. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Burchard said, "Where does that come from?" "My hillside," she said. "The brush they eat up there. It goes into the milk. The milk goes into the cheese." She opened her folder. "Now let me show you what that hillside produced in revenue over the last 8 months." She went through the numbers the way she'd rehearsed them, clearly, without rushing, answering questions when they came up, and not over-explaining when they didn't. She addressed the partial payments directly before anyone asked. Here's why they happened. Here's what changed. Here's the current cash flow situation. She addressed the water rights dispute with the yield assessment document and explained that the well provided adequate backup. She laid out the expansion plan and the revenue projections and was careful to present them as projections. Not promises, not guarantees, but reasonable estimates grounded in actual production history. Croft asked 2 questions. Both were pointed, and she answered both of them the same way she'd answered Pell's question about things not represented in the papers. Honestly and without flinching, because the quickest way to lose a room full of people who assess risk for a living was to seem like you were hiding anything. The second question was, has Mr. Voss expressed any concern to you directly about your operation's future? She looked at him steadily. Mr. Voss expressed his concern about my operation at the auction yard 9 months ago, in public, with an audience. Since then, I've been too busy to pay much attention to what he thinks. A beat. Burchard made a sound that might have been a laugh. Pell said, "Thank you, Mrs. Mercer. We'll be in contact within the week." She gathered her documents, closed the wooden box, and shook hands with each of the men at the table. When she got to Croft, he held her hand for a half-second longer than the others and said, quietly enough that it didn't carry, "You have good product, Mrs. Mercer." She said, "I know." She was 3 miles from home when the weather changed. It came in from the northwest the way the bad storms usually came. Fast, without much warning, the sky going from gray to the particular greenish dark that meant something serious was forming. By the time she reached the property gate, the wind was pushing hard enough that she had to hold the reins with both hands, and the horse was unhappy about the direction they were going. Caleb met her at the barn. "Board meeting?" "Done." She got the horse inside before she said anything else. "We'll know by the end of the week." He looked at the sky. "Storm coming." "I know." "The goats are already in the south shelter." She nodded. The south shelter was a 3-sided structure they'd built from salvaged timber in November. And it wasn't much to look at, but it cut the wind, and that was mostly what mattered with animals who had enough sense to press together for warmth when the temperature dropped. Eleanor would have moved them there already. She'd learned that. It was simply what Eleanor did when weather changed. "I need to check the cellar," Mara said. "If the temperature drops hard tonight, I checked it an hour ago." Caleb put his hand on her arm, just briefly. "It's fine. Everything's fine. Come inside." She let herself be led inside, which was not something she let happen easily or often. They sat at the kitchen table while the storm built outside, and Caleb made coffee, and the wind came down from the ridge with the sound of something that had been holding itself back for weeks, and finally decided not to anymore. The window glass flexed in its frame. The lamp on the table wavered and steadied. "How did it go?" Caleb said. Actually, she thought about the room, the 6 men, the cheese on the cloth in the center of the oval table, Croft's face when he tasted it. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I said everything I had to say." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "Either that's enough or it isn't." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the storm was fully arrived now, the kind of storm that reminds you how small a house is against a real stretch of open sky. "Caleb," she set down the cup, "whatever the board decides, I need you to know that this is real. What we built here. Even if they say no, even if Voss manages to—" She stopped. "This is real. It already happened. Nobody can take back the last 9 months." He looked at her across the table. The lamplight moved across his face, and she thought, not for the first time, that she had made good decisions in her life and terrible ones, and one that had been almost certainly both at the same time. And the decision that had turned out to be the most important wasn't the goats. It was the man sitting across from her now, who had picked up a shovel in a flooded cellar without being asked, and hadn't once told her she was wrong, even when she wasn't sure herself. "I know it's real," he said simply. The storm hammered the roof. In the south shelter, 37 goats pressed together against the wind. On the aging rack in the root cellar, 12 wheels of pale, firm, carefully made cheese sat in the dark, doing what they were made to do. The bank's answer was coming, and something else was coming too. Something that would arrive with the specific cruelty of a man who had decided that if he couldn't stop her through the front door, he would find the back one. She didn't know the shape of it yet, but she had learned, over 9 months of building something on rock and brush and nothing else, that the moment things started working was exactly when you had to watch the edges. She picked up her grandmother's journal from the corner of the table and opened it to a page she hadn't read in weeks. An entry from late in the old woman's life, tucked between a recipe for brine wash and a complaint about a leaking roof, and found the sentence she'd been looking for without knowing she was looking for it. "The ones who want to stop you will always wait until you have something worth stopping." She closed the journal. She listened to the storm. She did not sleep well that night, and the bank's answer, when it came 4 days later, arrived at the same moment as a piece of news that made the loan approval feel like only the beginning of something much harder than anything she'd already been through. The loan approval came on a Monday. Howard Pell delivered it himself, which was not standard procedure, and the fact that he drove out to the ranch rather than sending a letter told her something about how the board vote had gone. Not unanimous, she suspected, but decisive enough that he wanted to be the one to deliver it in person rather than let a piece of paper do the work. She was in the yard when his wagon came up the drive, sorting through a pile of lumber she'd gotten from a demolished feed barn 2 miles north. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked to meet him. He handed her the envelope without preamble. 4-2, he said quietly. "In your favor." She looked at him. "Croft?" "Voted yes." He said it with the same neutral face he brought to everything, but something in his tone suggested this had surprised him too. The yield assessment helped. The contracts were solid. He paused. The cheese didn't hurt. She opened the envelope and read the approval letter standing in her own driveway with sawdust on her boots. And she felt the thing she always felt when something she'd been fighting for finally arrived. Not elation, not relief exactly, but a kind of settling, like a building whose foundation had just been confirmed load-bearing. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. You did the work." He climbed back onto his wagon. "Mrs. Mercer, the two who voted no. One of them I expected, the other one surprised me." He picked up his reins. "Just be aware that the conversation about your operation didn't end in that room." She watched him drive away and stood in the yard holding the approval letter for a moment longer than she needed to, because she knew what he meant, and she'd known since Deke Calloway's visit that knowing something was coming and being ready for it were still two different categories of information. She went inside and put the letter on the kitchen table and was still standing there when Caleb came in from the east pasture. He read her face before he read the letter. "Good news or complicated news?" "Both," she said. Same envelope. The complicated news arrived 3 days later, and it came through Garrett Boone, who showed up at her gate on a Thursday morning looking like a man who'd been deciding how to say something for most of the drive over. She knew from the way he got down from the wagon. People who are bringing good news move differently. "Tell me," she said. He came into the kitchen and sat down and told her. Voss had not gone back to the bank after the loan approval. He'd done something more precise than that. He'd gone to the two freight companies that supplied the northern freight route, the same route that carried Mara's cheese to the mining camps. And he'd had conversations with their dispatch managers that Garrett described as quiet but expensive. He hadn't threatened anyone. He hadn't needed to. He'd simply made it known that his operation was considering an exclusive freight arrangement with one of the two companies, which would be the largest single freight contract in the valley, and that he expected his business partners to think carefully about where their other loyalties lay. One company had already told Garrett they'd be stepping back from the Whitlock cheese deliveries pending a review of route logistics. The other hadn't said anything yet, which in its own way said something. Mara sat across from Garrett and let him finish, and then she said, "What's the timeline?" "The first company told me end of month. If I can't find alternative freight by then, the northern route goes dark. Which means the mining camp orders go unfulfilled, which means the contracts get reviewed." He looked at her. Mara. It was the first time he'd used her first name. "If those contracts get reviewed, the bank can reassess the loan terms. They approved based on forward revenue. If the forward revenue disappears, I understand what it means." She stood up and went to the window. The south hillside was bright under early spring sunlight, the brush putting out new growth that the goats were already investigating with their characteristic thorough attention. Eleanor was halfway up the slope, standing still the way she did when she was watching something the others hadn't noticed yet. "He's not going after the land this time," Mara said. "He's going after the market." "Yes. Because he couldn't get the bank to stop the loan, so now he's going to try to make the loan meaningless." "That's what it looks like to me." Garrett had his hands flat on the table. "I still have one independent freight operator who isn't beholden to Voss. Call him Reedy. Runs a smaller outfit, 3 wagons, based out of the Northern Pass. He's not as reliable as the bigger companies and his rates are higher, but he's not in Voss's pocket. Is he enough to cover the northern route?" "Not alone. Not at the volume you need." She turned from the window. "What if I covered part of it myself?" Garrett looked at her carefully. "What do you mean?" "I have a wagon. I have a horse that can manage the North Road in decent weather. The mining camps are 2 days out and 2 days back. If I can run 1 trip a month myself and Reedy covers the rest—" "Mara, the North Road in early spring. I know what the North Road is in early spring." She sat back down across from him. "What are the contract terms if I miss a delivery?" 7-day grace period. After that, they can renegotiate." 7 days. She thought. "If I leave the morning a Reedy delivery is scheduled and he gets delayed, which he does, you told me he's not always reliable. I can be there within the grace window. That's a 2-day mountain road, alone." "I've done worse." Garrett looked at her for a long moment. "You have a cracked rib." She blinked. "Who told you that?" "Caleb. When I came by last month. He mentioned it the way people mention things they're worried about and don't know how to bring up directly. He didn't make it an accusation. I'm not saying don't go. I'm saying go in knowing the whole picture. She looked at her hands on the table. The rib had been better for weeks. Not right, not the way it had been before, but well enough that she'd stopped thinking about it most days. This was not one of those days, because now that he'd mentioned it, she felt it. The contract at the mining camps, she said. Who do I need to talk to directly? Not the foreman, who actually holds the agreement? A man named Dalton Cross. He's the supply coordinator for the entire northern operation. He was at the first delivery, he tasted the cheese himself. He's the one who converted a small trial order into the standing agreement. Garrett paused. He's also the kind of man who needs to see that you're serious about delivery. Not hear it, see it. Then I need to be on that road. Yes. Garrett stood. I'll get word to Reedy today, and I'll write to Cross explaining the freight situation. Not the Voss part, just the route logistics, so he has context if there's a timing issue. After Garrett left, Mara sat at the table alone for 10 minutes, doing the things she'd learned to do when the pressure came from too many directions at once. She narrowed it. She picked the one thing she could actually control in the next 24 hours and focused on that and let everything else wait. The one thing she could control was the cheese. She had 8 wheels coming off the rack in 3 days. They needed to be perfect. Whatever happened on the road, whatever Voss did or didn't do, the thing in the wooden box had to be worth the trip. She went to the cellar. Caleb found out about the mountain road plan that evening, which was later than he should have, and he was quiet about it in the specific way that meant he was not fine with it, but had already understood there was no argument he could make that would change the outcome. You're going alone, he said. It wasn't a question. You can't manage the herd alone for 4 days if you're also on the road. And I can't leave the herd with nobody. I could ask Deke. We're not asking Deke for another favor. We've already taken enough of his goodwill. She was packing the wooden crate, wrapping each wheel carefully. I know the North Road. I drove it with my father twice. In summer. It's April. It's not summer, but it's not February either. He sat down on the kitchen chair and watched her work, and she could feel him deciding whether to push harder or not. And she gave him the space to decide, because she had told herself a long time ago that she wouldn't make decisions for him the way she'd occasionally been tempted to. Take the heavier blankets, he said finally. There's still snow on the upper pass. I know. And the good knife. Not the belt one. The one in the drawer. All right. He was quiet for another moment, then 4 days. 4 days. Maybe 3.5 if the road is dry. I'll keep the home fire going, he said, which was not a thing he usually said. And she looked at him, and he was looking at the crate. Caleb. She stopped packing. This is the piece of it that holds everything together. If the northern contracts go dark, the bank... I know why you're going. He looked up at her. I'm not asking you not to go. I'm telling you to take the heavy blankets. She nodded. She went and found the heavy blankets. She left before dawn on a Saturday, the wagon loaded with 8 wheels in the wooden crate, padded with straw, and covered with oilcloth against weather. The horse was a solid, uncomplaining animal named Bram, who had been with them for 6 years, and who managed rough roads with a particular unglamorous competence that she had always appreciated. She'd checked his shoes herself the evening before and given him extra feed and spoken to him the way she spoke to the goats when she needed them to cooperate with something they weren't sure about. The valley road was easy for the first 4 hours. Then the terrain began to change. The north road climbed out of the valley through a series of switchbacks that her father had called the staircase. Not because they were gentle, but because each one felt like a step up into a different kind of country, colder and rockier and less forgiving of mistakes. By mid-morning, she was above the tree line on the lower slopes, and the wind had picked up enough to make her ears ache. She pulled her coat tighter and kept Bram to a pace that was slow enough to be safe and fast enough to make the timing work. The rib announced itself around noon when she hit a rough section of road that jarred the wagon hard enough to make her grab the bench with both hands. Not the sharp pain of something new happening, she'd learned to distinguish between those, but the dull, specific ache of something that was healed enough to function and not healed enough to forget it was there. She adjusted her position on the bench and kept going. The first night she camped in a hollow below the upper pass where her father had always stopped. a spot that had natural windbreak from a rock formation on 3 sides. She made a small fire, ate the food she'd packed, checked on Bram, checked on the cheese in the crate, and sat for a while looking at the sky, which was clear and very cold and crowded with stars that were brighter at this elevation than she ever remembered them being from the valley floor. She did not think about Voss. She had made a deliberate decision not to think about Voss until she was back in the valley, because there was nothing she could do about him from here, and thinking about him would only burn energy she needed for other things. She thought about the cheese instead, about whether the temperature variation of the trip would affect the rinds, about whether she'd packed the straw densely enough around the lower wheels to prevent the vibration of the road from cracking anything. She thought about the first batch she'd made, the one that spoiled in 9 days, and about the 6 attempts after that, and about the evening in September when she'd cut open the 5-week wheel and understood for the first time that what she was doing was real. She went to sleep at 9 and woke at 4 and got back on the road. The upper pass in early April was exactly what Caleb had been afraid of. Not impassable. She'd been right about that. But the kind of road that required your full attention every quarter mile, patches of ice in the shadows, soft muddy sections where the snowmelt had undermined the track, one section where a section of the road's edge had slumped away entirely, and she had to take Bram across the uphill side at a careful angle that made the wagon lean in a way she didn't enjoy. She got through the pass by early afternoon and started down the northern descent, and the going got easier as the elevation dropped and the road dried out. By the time she reached the flatland below the ridge, the worst of it was behind her, and Bram had stopped being nervous and was walking with the comfortable purposefulness of an animal who knew they were making progress. She arrived at the mining camp settlement an hour before dark on the second day. It was larger than she'd expected, a permanent settlement of several hundred people clustered around 3 active mines, with a proper supply depot, a cook operation feeding the work crews, and the particular dense, practical energy of a place where people were constantly working and not interested in anything that wasn't directly useful. She'd thought about how she would present herself when she arrived, and had decided on the same principle she'd used with Hetty Boone: lead with the product. She found the supply depot and asked for Dalton Cross. He came out looking like a man who'd had a long day and expected the evening to be more of the same. Heavy-set, somewhere in his 50s, with the careful eyes of someone who had been sold things his whole career and had developed a professional suspicion of anyone arriving with a wagon. He looked at Mara. He looked at the wagon. He looked at the oilcloth cover on the crate. "You're the cheese woman," he said. "Mara Mercer." She got down from the wagon. "I understand there may be a disruption to my freight schedule. I wanted to make sure this delivery happened in person." "You drove the North Road alone?" "Yes." He looked at the wagon again, then back at her. "In April." The pass was manageable. She opened the crate and took out one of the wrapped wheels and held it out. "I'd like you to taste the current batch before we talk business. I always find it helps to settle what we're actually discussing." A moment. Then Cross took the wheel from her, unwrapped one end, and cut a piece off with the knife on his belt. Not a careful, polite slice, but the direct cut of a working man deciding something. He chewed it seriously. He didn't say anything for a long beat. Then he said, "This is better than the last shipment. I've been refining the aging process. The spring milk is also richer. The brush is putting on new growth." She kept her voice even. "I can deliver 8 wheels this month, 12 by June, and I'm expanding the herd through the summer." "I heard you were having freight issues." "Temporary." She met his eyes. "I'm here, aren't I?" Something shifted in his face. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of professional acknowledgement. The recognition one practical person extends to another when they've demonstrated they mean what they say. "Come inside," he said. "Let's talk about the June numbers." She was in Cross's supply office for 2 hours, and she came out with the standing order confirmed at increased volume and a handshake that meant more than the paper they'd signed, because Cross was clearly the kind of man who considered the handshake the real agreement and the paper a formality for the lawyers. He'd also introduced her to 2 other supply managers from adjacent operations who had heard about the cheese from his crew, and both of them had taken samples, and both of them had the look of men who were going to be placing orders. She ate dinner at the camp cook's table, which was the best meal she'd had in weeks simply by virtue of being food she hadn't made herself, and slept in the depot's spare room on a cot that was narrow and slightly damp, and was nonetheless the most deeply she'd slept in longer than she could remember, because the thing she'd been driving toward for 2 days was done, and her body finally felt like it had permission to rest. She left at dawn and made the return trip in a day and a half, faster than the climb, because the northern descent was gentle and Bram was motivated in the way horses get when they know they're going home. The problem was waiting for her when she got there. Not a person. A letter, sitting on the kitchen table, already opened. Caleb was at the table when she came in, and his face told her before he said a word. The letter was from the First Agricultural Bank of Red Hollow Ridge. It was signed by Howard Pell, but the language in it was not Pell's language. It was the language of legal correspondence, formal and precise, and constructed to be technically accurate while communicating something that the sender preferred not to state plainly. What it said, plainly stated, was this. Due to a formal complaint filed regarding the water rights dispute on the Mercer property and certain concerns raised about the operational stability of the business, the board was exercising its right under the loan terms to request full documentation review within 30 days and was simultaneously accelerating the timeline on the existing mortgage, which meant that the balance she and Caleb already owed, the original debt, not the new expansion loan, was now due in full within 60 days rather than on its existing schedule. She read it twice. She set it down. The number at the bottom of the letter was not a number she had. Not close. Not within range of anything she could generate in 60 days, even with the mining camp orders and Hetty's sales and everything else running perfectly. When did this arrive? She said. Yesterday afternoon. Caleb's hands were flat on the table. Mara, the water rights complaint. That's Voss. That's what triggered the review clause. She picked up the letter again and read the specific clause they were citing. It was real. It was in the original mortgage language she had signed 3 years ago, a standard clause that she had read and understood and assessed as low risk because water disputes in the valley were common and rarely formalized. He finally found the door. What door? The back one. She set the letter down again. He couldn't stop the loan from the front, so he formalized the water dispute, which triggered the review clause in the original mortgage, which gave the bank a legitimate mechanism to accelerate the timeline. She looked up at Caleb. It's not illegal. It's not even wrong, technically. It's precise. He found the precise thing. Caleb was quiet. How much? She told him the number. He absorbed it the way he absorbed the really bad things, completely still, like he was making sure it was real before he decided how to feel about it. That's not possible in 60 days. No. Not from the operation alone. No. She put the letter in her coat pocket. I need to talk to Garrett. It's almost dark. I know. She went to the door. Keep the coffee on. She drove to Garrett's office in town, arriving after dark, and knocked on the back door that his operation used for late business. He answered in his shirt sleeves, looking like a man who'd been working late himself, and she handed him the letter without explanation and watched him read it. He read it twice, the way she had. Then he set it on his desk and sat down and said, He's good. I know he's good. The water rights complaint is just a vehicle. Even if you win it, and you probably would, the common use argument is solid. The formal filing is enough to trigger the review clause. By the time you resolve the underlying dispute, the 60 days will be gone. How much could you pull from the freight advance? Against future deliveries? He thought. Maybe a third of the number, possibly a little more if I prepay the summer orders. That's not enough. No. She sat down across from him. What about the mining camp orders? Cross said he'd introduce me to the other supply managers. If those orders converted to signed contracts, could we use them as collateral for a bridge loan from a different lender? Garrett was already thinking. There's a private lending firm out of the Northern Supply District. They work with freight operations, not banks. They move faster and they're more expensive, but they don't care about water rights disputes. He paused. The rate would be punishing. What rate? He told her. It was punishing. She did the math in her head, and the math was ugly, but it was not impossible. Not if the summer orders came in as projected, not if nothing went wrong in the next 4 months, not if everything she was building held together. The problem was that nothing had ever gone entirely right for 4 straight months in her life, and she knew that, and she was trying to be honest with herself about what she was actually signing up for. There's another option, Garrett said carefully. She looked at him. Voss has been buying out smaller operations for 3 years. He offered to buy your land once before. He said it the way you say something you know will be received badly, but have decided to say anyway. If you went to him and sold, no. Mara, no. She said it without heat, without drama. I understand why you're saying it. I understand the math behind it. The answer is no. She stood up. Get me the contact information for the private lender. I'll drive to the Northern District tomorrow. He looked at her for a long moment. You just drove the North Road and back. I know. She picked up her coat. I'll sleep tonight. She did sleep. Not well, and not long, but she slept, because she had learned that you couldn't make good decisions while running on empty, and she needed the next 24 hours to count. In the gray period before she fell asleep, she lay in the dark and thought about what Garrett had said. He's good. And she thought about what her grandmother had written. The ones who want to stop you will always wait until you have something worth stopping. And she thought about the 60-day number and the bridge loan rate and what 4 good months would need to look like. She thought about what she'd built, piece by piece, from a flooded root cellar and a spoiled first batch, and 3 wheels buried behind the east fence, and a ledger full of her grandmother's handwriting. She thought about Caleb digging drainage in the cold, and Eleanor pressing against her shoulder in the January pasture. She thought about Hetty Boone cutting herself a second piece without asking, and Dalton Cross saying, "This is better than the last shipment," with the particular directness of a man not given to compliments. She thought about Roland Voss saying, "Just rock," same as it's always been. She fell asleep thinking about the bridge loan, and woke up thinking about it, and was on the road north before most of the valley was awake. The lender's name was a man named Archibald Finch, and he ran his operation out of a stone building that smelled like wool and pipe smoke and money in the particular form that money takes when it's been working for a long time. He was in his 60s, sharp-eyed, with the energy of a man who hadn't slowed down yet and resented the implication that he might. She laid everything on his desk. The contracts, the production numbers, the bank letter, the water rights assessment, the mining camp orders, the letter from Cross confirming the increased volume, and the handwritten projections she'd done the night before showing what the next 4 months looked like under 3 scenarios: good, average, and bad. Finch read for 20 minutes without speaking. When he finished, he looked up and said, "You prepared 3 scenarios." "Yes. Most people bring me the good one." "I'm not interested in telling you a story," she said. "I'm interested in a number that works for both of us." He looked at the papers for another moment. Then he named a rate that was high, and terms that were tight, and a repayment structure that left her no margin for the kind of mistakes she'd been making regularly for the past 9 months. She negotiated him down slightly on the rate and slightly on the timing and accepted the rest, because she had assessed what was available and what wasn't, and she was not going to walk away from possible because it wasn't perfect. Perfect had never been on the table. She'd understood that since the first morning she'd stood at the kitchen window at 4 a.m. with cold coffee and $2 in her front pocket. She drove home with the bridge loan agreement in her satchel and the 60-day clock already running in her head, and she was halfway down the valley road when the summer heat started in earnest. Not warm, not pleasant, but the particular heavy, airless heat of a dry year announcing itself early, the kind of heat that bleached the grass pale by June and cracked the clay in the low pastures and made everyone in Red Hollow Ridge look at the sky and start doing the worried arithmetic of water and feed and how long the wells would hold. She looked at those hills, at the brush on the rocky slopes that nobody else had ever wanted. Green, still green. Not lush, it had never been lush, but holding its color against the pale sky in the specific stubborn way of plants that had spent generations learning to exist where other things couldn't. She pulled Bram to a stop for a moment in the middle of the road and just looked at it. The heat that would ruin other people's cattle and dry out their pastures was not going to touch what she had on those hillsides. That brush didn't need what grass needed. It didn't need what anything easy needed. She knew something about that. She clicked to Bram and kept going, and somewhere behind her on the slope she couldn't see from the road, 37 goats moved through the heat without complaint, eating what the land gave and giving back what they had. And in the root cellar below the house, 12 wheels of pale-aged cheese sat in the dark, doing what they were made to do, and none of it was perfect, and none of it was easy, and it was absolutely undeniably real. The 60-day clock was not an abstraction. It was a physical thing, as real to Mara as the ache in her side or the weight of the satchel on her shoulder. She felt it from the moment she woke up every morning until the moment she finally stopped moving each night. A steady pressure behind everything she did that didn't lift or ease or give her even a single hour of not knowing it was there. She had mapped it out the night she got back from Finch's office. 60 days. 43 of them needed to produce enough revenue, combined with the bridge loan and Garrett's prepaid freight advance, to cover the accelerated mortgage balance that Voss had engineered into existence. The remaining 17 days were the margin, and she'd learned enough about her own operation by now to know that margins got eaten. Something always cost more than you planned. Something always took longer. The margin was not rest. It was the space where reality corrected your arithmetic. She told Caleb the full number the night she got home. Not the softened version, not the version where she'd already done the math and was presenting him with a plan. The raw number, what they owed and when, and what had to happen for them to meet it. He sat with it for a long time without speaking. She let him. "The summer orders from Cross," he said finally. "Those are signed?" "Signed and in the satchel." "And the two other supply managers, you said they took samples." "They did. Garrett's following up this week." Caleb nodded slowly. "So if those convert, we're still short, not by much, but short." She'd been over the arithmetic 20 times. The herd needs to produce at the higher rate for the full 60 days. No illness, no drop in yield, no equipment failure in the cellar that sets back an aging cycle. She paused. "All of that has to go right." "It's gone wrong before." "I know. Not just once." "Caleb, I know." She looked at him across the table. "I'm not telling you it's certain. I'm telling you it's possible. And possible is what we have." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said the thing she hadn't let herself say yet. "And if it doesn't work?" She'd thought about this. She'd thought about it on the road home, in the empty part of the afternoon when there was nothing to do but drive and think. She'd tried to be honest with herself about what the failure scenario actually looked like, because she'd found over the past year that imagining the worst thing clearly was less terrifying than leaving it vague. Vague disasters had unlimited dimensions. Real ones had edges. "We lose the land," she said, "probably to Voss eventually, because he'll be positioned to buy it if the bank forecloses. The herd, I could sell the herd separately maybe. The brand has value now, the cheese has a reputation. It wouldn't be nothing." She stopped. "But the land goes." Caleb looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He had the kind of hands that told the story of a working life without any help from words. Scarred at the knuckles, rough at the palms, the right one still slightly swollen at the wrist from the fence post fall in January. "Then we don't lose it," he said. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't a declaration. It was just a man making a decision, stated plainly, the way he did most things. She nodded. "Then we don't lose it. What?" The heat settled over the valley like something that had decided to stay. By the third week of May, it was the driest spring anyone could remember, and the talk at the feed store and the post office, and Hetty Boone's counter had the particular edgy quality of farming communities watching the sky and finding it unhelpful. Cattle ranchers were already moving herds to lower ground looking for what little grass was left. 2 operations north of the ridge had sold off animals early to cut feed costs. Deke Calloway lost a well in the first week of June and spent a week looking 10 years older than he had in March. Mara watched all of this from the south hillside with Eleanor standing 3 feet away doing the same, and she felt the thing she'd tried not to feel since the beginning, the particular guilt of someone whose luck runs counter to everyone else's misfortune. The brush on the rocky slopes had not noticed the drought in any meaningful way. It was doing exactly what it had always done, which was thrive on conditions that defeated more delicate things. The goats were producing at the highest volume since she'd bought them. The milk was richer than it had been in fall or winter, and the cheese she was pulling off the aging rack in June was, she said this quietly, to herself, in the cellar alone, the best she had ever made. It tasted like a dry summer, concentrated and complex and full of the specific character of animals that had been eating brush on rocky hills through a season that asked a lot of everything. She was in the cellar checking the rack when she heard wagon wheels in the yard, and then Caleb's voice, and then a voice she didn't recognize. She came up to find a man she'd never seen before standing next to Caleb, holding his hat in front of him with both hands in the particular posture of someone who has come to ask for something and isn't sure how it will be received. He introduced himself as Prentice All, a small rancher from the other side of the North Ridge. He'd heard about the cheese from a supply manager up there, one of the 2 Cross had introduced her to, and he'd also heard, through the network that transmitted everything eventually, that she'd been building her operation on brush goats. His cattle were failing. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, the way things fail in a drought, losing condition week by week, the feed costs climbing while the animal's value dropped. He had 12 acres of rocky hillside that he'd always considered useless. He wanted to know if she'd sell him breeding stock and teach him what she knew. Mara stood in her yard and looked at this man, who was probably 10 years older than her and had the hollow-eyed look of someone running on less sleep than was good for him, and she thought about what it had cost her to figure out what she now knew, and about what her grandmother had written down in the margins of an old ledger for no one in particular. "I'll sell you 4 does and a buck," she said. "Good breeding stock, not the older animals. Fair market price." He named a price that was below fair. She told him a number that was above his offer and below what she'd have charged someone she didn't trust. They settled in the middle, which was where honest deals settled. "The knowledge part," she said. "That's different. You can't buy that. But I'll show you what I know if you're willing to work for it." He looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means you come here 3 days a week for 6 weeks and you do whatever needs doing. Milking, cellar work, fence repair, whatever the operation needs that day. And while you're doing it, I'll teach you what I know." She paused. "It's how my grandmother learned. It's how I learned. You don't get it from a book." He agreed. They shook hands. He came back Tuesday. Within 2 weeks, there were 2 more men who'd heard about Prentice All's arrangement and wanted similar terms. She said yes to one and told the other to come back in September when she had more capacity. She was not running a school. She was running a business that happened to generate knowledge as a byproduct, and she was not going to let the teaching eat the operation it was built on. But the additional revenue from the breeding stock sales helped. Not enough to change the fundamental arithmetic, but enough to shift the margin slightly in her direction, which was the kind of difference that mattered when you were living inside a 60-day window with 15 days left. Garrett came by in the 3rd week of June with the contracts from Cross's 2 colleagues. Both signed, both at volumes that were more than the samples she'd given them had led her to expect. He put them on her kitchen table with the particular careful movement of a man who knows what he's carrying and doesn't want to drop it. "Both of them," she said. "Both of them." He sat down. "Combined with what you already have from Cross, your forward order book is the largest it's ever been." She looked at the numbers. She did the math, again for the 100th time, but with these numbers, with the breeding stock sales, with the bridge loan already partially serviced by the prepaid freight advance. She went through it slowly, checking each element. She looked up at Garrett. "We're close." "How close?" $4 short. She said it flatly because it was almost funny. Almost. He stared at her. $4. "If everything hits on time, if no delivery is late, if the seller doesn't lose a batch, if the breeding stock payment clears this week." She set down the pencil. $4. He was quiet for a moment. Then he opened his coat, reached into the inside pocket, and put $4 on the table. She looked at the money. She looked at him. "Don't," he said before she could speak. "It's not charity. It's an advance against your next delivery. Put it in the ledger as such." She picked up the $4. She held them for a moment, and she thought about 2 other dollars she'd held in her hand once, folded soft at the creases, standing in an auction yard while a crowd laughed at her. She thought about the distance between those 2 moments, measured not in months, but in everything that had happened inside them. The failed batches, and the flooded cellar, and the cracked rib she'd never mentioned, and the mountain road in April and 60 nights of lying awake doing arithmetic that never came out clean enough. "Put it in the ledger," she said, "already done in my head." She folded the $4 and put them in her front pocket, where she used to keep the 2. She went to the bank on a Thursday morning, 17 days before the deadline, with the full payment in a bank draft that Finch's lending firm had processed the previous afternoon. She also brought the new contracts, the updated production records, the breeding stock sale receipts, and a 1-page document she'd written the night before that she'd decided, at the last minute, to include. Howard Pell received her in the same office where they'd had the first conversation, back in March, and she handed him the payment draft and the supporting documents without saying anything about them, because the documents said what they needed to say. He looked at the draft. He looked at the contracts. He went through the production records with the careful attention he brought to everything, and she sat across from him and let him read, the same way she'd let him read in March. When he finished, he set everything down. This covers the accelerated balance. In full, plus the first quarter of the expansion loan. He looked at her over his glasses. Mrs. Mercer, I want to be direct with you about something. I'd appreciate that. The board's decision to accelerate the mortgage timeline. He chose his words carefully. It was within the letter of the loan terms, but I want you to know that I argued against it. She looked at him. Why are you telling me this? Because I think you deserve to know. He folded his hands on the desk. The water rights complaint that triggered the review clause was filed by a party with an interest in your failure. The board knew that. 2 members chose to act on it anyway. He paused. Those 2 members are no longer on the board as of last week. She absorbed this. What happened? One resigned. One was asked to step back due to what the remaining board characterized as a conflict of interest. His expression was entirely neutral, but something behind it was not. The water rights complaint has also been formally dismissed by the county assessor's office. The common use argument held. The creek is shared water, same as it's always been. She sat with all of this for a moment. She had come in prepared to be businesslike and precise and to not let anything in the room touch her more than it needed to, and she found that she needed another moment before she could speak. The expansion loan terms, she said, are they still intact? Intact and unchanged. He picked up a pen. I'd like to discuss the possibility of improving them, actually, given the updated revenue picture. She allowed herself one thing, small and private. She pressed her lips together for exactly 1 second, and then she leaned forward and said, Let's talk about the terms. She was back home by noon. The yard was empty when she pulled in, Caleb out somewhere on the property. The herd spread across the hillside in the midday heat with the lazy, purposeful energy of animals who had figured out the best spots and were using them. Eleanor was at the top of the slope again, in her usual place, standing in the thin shadow of a rock outcrop and watching the valley below with what Mara had long since stopped pretending was just animal behavior and had started accepting as something she didn't have a better word for than attention. She sat on the wagon bench for a few minutes after she stopped Bram. She didn't go inside. She just sat there and looked at the hillside and let the past year sit with her without trying to organize it or summarize it or make it into something it wasn't yet. Caleb found her there 20 minutes later. He came around the side of the barn, saw her sitting in the wagon, and stopped. Well, he said, paid in full. She held up the receipt. He walked to the wagon and took the receipt from her hand and read it. He read it twice. He folded it carefully and handed it back to her. Then he sat down on the wagon bench beside her, which put the 2 of them sitting next to each other the way they used to sit on the porch in the early evenings before things got hard, before the evenings got eaten by work and worry and the permanent low hum of not having enough. They sat like that for a while without saying anything. Pell said 2 board members are gone, she said. The water rights complaint was dismissed. I heard something about that this morning. Deke told me. News travels. In this valley, it travels before it happens. He was quiet for a moment. Voss know yet? I'd imagine so. She looked at the hillside. He'll know about the mortgage payment by end of day. Smaller valley than it looks. What do you think he does next? She thought about it honestly. I think he recalculates. She paused. He's not stupid. He's done 3 separate things to try to stop this operation, and none of them worked. At some point, a man like that looks at the numbers and decides the energy is better spent somewhere else. Caleb was quiet. Or he gets stubborn. He might. She turned to look at him. But we're not waiting on what he does. We're going to be too busy to wait. She was right about Voss recalculating. She was partially wrong about the timeline. He came to her gate on a Tuesday morning in July, alone. In a wagon he was driving himself rather than having his foreman drive, which told her something before he'd said a word. Men like Voss sent intermediaries for things they were comfortable with. They came themselves for things that cost them something to say. She was in the yard when he arrived. She did not go to the gate. She waited for him to come to her. He looked older than he'd looked at the auction yard a year ago, which might have been the summer heat, or might have been something else. He was a large man who had always carried his size like authority, and he still did, but something in the set of it had shifted slightly. Less like a man who held all the terrain, and more like a man who had recently discovered the terrain had other occupants. Mrs. Mercer, he said. Mr. Voss. He looked at the hillside. He looked at the operation. The expanded cellar entrance she'd built out in May, the new fencing, the water system Caleb had improved in June. He looked at all of it with the eyes of a man who understood what he was looking at and was doing the arithmetic. "I'd like to buy breeding stock," he said. She waited. "And I'd like to know how you're running the operation." He said it with the particular difficulty of a man who has never had to ask anyone for information and has not yet made peace with the need to start. "My east pasture is rock and brush, has been since my father's time. I've been watching what you've done with this land and He stopped. "I want to know if it translates." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the auction yard, about what he'd said, about how it had sounded and how the men around them had laughed. She thought about the bank board. She thought about the freight companies and the water rights filing and the mortgage acceleration letter and the $4 gap that had almost been the thing that ended everything. She thought about what it would feel like to say no. She held that feeling and examined it carefully and honestly, because she believed in being honest with herself about what she wanted, including the things she wasn't proud of wanting. Then she let it go. Not because she was a better person than her anger. She wasn't, always. But because what he was standing in front of her asking to learn was the thing she'd built from her grandmother's knowledge, and her grandmother had not kept that knowledge to herself. She'd written it down. She'd meant it to be used. And Mara was not going to honor that legacy by turning it into a wall. "I'll sell you breeding stock," she said. "Same terms as everyone else, fair market price." And the operation, one condition. She met his eyes. The water rights complaint, the freight company pressure, the bank board. She said each one plainly. "I want a formal written statement from you acknowledging those actions and withdrawing any outstanding claims or representations made to third parties about this operation's viability or my character." A silence. Voss held her gaze. Something moved across his face, not quite shame, because she doubted he was built for shame exactly, but something adjacent to it. The recognition of a man who knows what he did and is being asked to say so out loud in writing. "That's a significant ask," he said. "I know what it is." She didn't move. "Those are the terms. Take them or don't." Another silence. Longer this time. "I'll have my lawyer draw it up," he said. "I'll have Garrett Boone's lawyer review it before I sign anything." He nodded once. He looked at the hillside again, at the goats moving through the brush, at the particular scene of an operation that had built itself out of everything everyone had said couldn't be built. His face did something complicated that she didn't try to interpret. "Your grandmother," he said. "I remember her. From when I was young." She hadn't expected that. "You knew her?" "Not well. My father did. He said she was the most stubborn woman he'd ever met." He picked up his hat from where he'd been holding it. He didn't mean it as a compliment. Mara looked at him. "I'll take it as one." He put his hat on and walked back to his wagon and drove away. And she stood in the yard and watched him go. The formal statement arrived 3 weeks later, reviewed and approved by Garrett's lawyer, signed by Voss in handwriting that was controlled and deliberate and looked like it had cost him something. She read it at the kitchen table with Caleb sitting across from her, and then folded it and put it in the tin box under the floorboard. The same box where she'd kept the $2 before she spent them, now holding the most important paper she owned instead of the last money she had. The summer went on, and it was hot, and it was hard, and nothing was ever completely right all at once. She lost 2 wheels to a humidity problem in August that she still hadn't fully solved. One of the does from Prentice All's breeding purchase got sick, and she spent a week helping him manage it, time she didn't have, and gave anyway because she told him she would teach him what she knew, and illness was part of what she knew. Caleb's wrist got worse in the heat, and she watched him try not to show it, and didn't say anything, because he'd extended her the same courtesy for 11 months about the rib. They were not a perfect operation. They were never going to be a perfect operation. The cellar was still the cellar, underground and imperfect and constantly requiring attention. It would not ask for itself. The North Road was still the North Road. Eleanor was still Eleanor, opinionated and demanding and absolutely irreplaceable, moving through the herd with her particular unhurried authority, keeping order in the way that only made sense if you accepted that order was a thing some animals simply cared about more than others. The Territorial Agricultural Board sent a letter in September requesting samples for their annual regional review. Mara sent 6 wheels, her best 6 from the summer batch, the ones that had benefited from the richest milk she'd ever gotten. The ones that tasted when she cut them, like everything the past year had been. She didn't expect to hear anything for months. These things moved slowly, and she'd learned to focus on what she could affect rather than what she was waiting on. She was in the cellar in October, doing the quarterly inventory, when Caleb appeared at the top of the cellar stairs and said, "There's a letter." She came up. He was holding it with both hands, which was how she knew it was important before she read it. The Territorial Agricultural Board had awarded its highest regional distinction to a producer for the first time in 11 years. The letter was formal and official and used language that belonged to institutions and committees, but the substance of it was simple. What she made was the best of its kind in the territory. She read it twice. She put it down on the table. "Well," Caleb said. "Well," she said back. She thought about saying something larger than that. She had the feeling, standing in her kitchen in October with an award letter on the table and a year of impossible work behind her, that something significant was supposed to be said. Some summary, some acknowledgement of what it had all meant and cost and produced. But she'd never been good at speeches, and the thing the year had taught her, more than anything about cheese or goats or banks or stubborn men, was that the meaning was in the work itself. Not in talking about it after. The meaning was in the 4 a.m. mornings and the failed batches buried behind the east fence and the mountain road in April, and the $4 on the table, and Caleb digging drainage in the dark without being asked. It was in her grandmother's handwriting in the margins of an old ledger, writing things down for no one and everyone. There wasn't a sentence big enough for all of that. There wasn't supposed to be. She folded the letter and put it next to the tin box under the floorboard. Then she went and got her coat. "Where are you going?" Caleb said. "Cellar. I've got a new batch starting, and the temperature's been running low on the north shelf." He looked at her. "You just got an award." "I know." She pulled on her coat. "The cheese doesn't know that." He made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else entirely, and she went down to the cellar and got back to work. The valley changed that year in ways that people would talk about for a long time afterward, though they wouldn't always agree on what had caused the change or who deserved the credit for it. 3 more families started goat operations on rocky land they'd previously written off. Garrett Boone expanded his freight route to include 4 new northern stops specifically because of demand for specialty goods, cheese chief among them. Hetty Boone's counter became, improbably, a destination, people coming from an hour away for the aged wheels that she kept behind the glass. Prentice All's operation was struggling and improving in roughly equal measure, which was the honest rate of progress for a first-year operation, and he came by every Tuesday morning with specific questions that were getting better as the weeks passed, moving from, "What do I do about this?" to "Here's what I did. Does that make sense?" Which was the shift Mara had been waiting for, the one that told her he was going to be all right. Voss converted his east pasture to goats the following spring. His operation was larger than hers and less careful, at least at first, and the cheese he produced was not as good, and he knew it, which she suspected bothered him more than losing the bank battle had. He never came back to ask for more help. She didn't offer. Some lessons you had to work out yourself, and she didn't think she owed Roland Voss her grandmother's accumulated knowledge on top of everything else she'd already conceded. But he wasn't her enemy anymore. He was just another rancher trying to figure out what his land was good for, which was maybe the most honest thing a person in this valley could be. She thought about that sometimes. In the cellar, checking the rinds on the aging rack in the particular attentive quiet that the work required. She thought about how much energy she'd spent in the past year with Voss's voice in her head. Just rock, same as it's always been. And how little of that energy had been useful, and how hard it was, even knowing that, to stop doing it. She was not the kind of person who let things go easily. She was too much her grandmother's granddaughter for that. But she was getting better at deciding what was worth holding on to. The things worth holding, the way the light hit the south hillside in the late afternoon in October, everything going golden specific. Caleb's voice through the floor of the house when he talked to the animals in the barn, low and patient, not performing patience but actually having it. Eleanor pressing against her shoulder in the dark January pasture, solid and unhurried and present. The weight of a well-aged wheel in both hands, the rind firm, the interior doing what it was supposed to do. The $2 that had become this. All of it. The crooked, costly, irreplaceable this. On a morning in late October, just over a year since the auction, Mara came up from the cellar at first light with 4 new wheels wrapped and ready, set them in the wooden crate that had been to the bank board and to the mining camps and back, and carried it to the wagon herself. She had a delivery to Hetty, and then a meeting with Garrett about the winter schedule, and then she needed to get back by afternoon because she had a batch coming off the rack that she wanted to check herself, not leave it for later. Eleanor was at the gate of the south pasture when she passed, watching her with those particular eyes. Mara stopped. She looked at the animal that had looked at her through an auction yard fence a year ago with something that might have been a question, or might have been an accusation, or might have been neither. Just a goat looking at a woman, and a woman looking back and deciding something. She put her hand out over the gate. Eleanor pressed her nose into it once, briefly, with the matter-of-fact quality she brought to everything, and then turned back toward the hillside and started climbing. Mara watched her go. Then she clicked to Bram, turned the wagon toward the road, and headed toward town with the morning light coming up over the ridge in a way that asked nothing of her and offered nothing except itself. Which was enough. Which had always been enough. If you knew how to look at what was actually in front of you instead of what other people had decided you were allowed to see. She drove into the morning and let the valley open up around